So for our last unit this year, we're going to be exploring the novel as a genre. And so I'm calling this unit Introduction to Novel Theory. We're going to sort of think about how and why novels are written and what makes a novel a novel. And as sort of a subtitle for this unit, I've used Using Literature Circles to Explore the Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. That is the novel we're going to be exploring. And I'll get more into the novel itself in a bit. But first of all, what is this thing called literature circles, and how and why are we going to be using it in this last unit? So for this final novel, Ms. Patel and I have decided that it is best explored cooperatively. Reading is often a very solitary activity, so that will remain the case. You'll be reading the novel, alone. But you'll be discussing it and wrestling with it in groups, hopefully to deepen your understanding of it. So, what are literature circles? So here's a brief overview. You will read a novel and meet 3 to 4 days per week in a group of 4 in order to discuss it and engage in literary analysis. Each member of the group has a specific function. Each member will be assessed on how they perform their function, so you're ultimately responsible for yourself. And the goal is to attain a deeper understanding of the novel by learning cooperatively. So the daily routine of the class will change a bit. When you come in, you will no longer grab a Chromebook. A little bit later, in a few days or so, we will instruct some members of the class to grab Chromebooks, only because their function in the literature circle group will require it. But for right now, we're not going to be needing the Chromebooks anymore. Again, later on, we will certainly be using them, but not right away. So when you will find your seat and you will take out the following. Your copy of the novel, which will be assigned to you and for which you'll be responsible, and you'll be signing a textbook contract for that novel. Number 2, what you prepared for the day's discussion. And number 3, your notebook, i.e. where you take your notes. And that will also serve, as a sort of reading journal. All right. So again, the daily routine will be: you will come in, you will no longer grab a Chromebook, you'll have a seat, and you will take out these 3 things: your copy of the novel, what you prepared for the day's discussion, and your notebook. And again, the novel will be distributed to you. So these literature circles consist of 4 people. 2 groups will have 5. These roles will be doubled. But here are the 4 roles that will that make up each literature circle group. The first is the discussion director. The second is the passage picker. The third is the connection maker. And the fourth is the summarizer in WordWizard. In the Google Classroom is a more extensive document that lists the specific responsibilities for these roles and how those responsibilities sort of dovetail with the unit. But just briefly, the discussion director is the person responsible for keeping the group on task and for providing the discussion questions for that particular session of the Lit Circle. The passage picker is responsible for choosing passages from the novel that reflect the questions brought up by the discussion director. So they are the evidence gatherers. The connection maker is then responsible for taking the question that the discussion director posed, the passage that the passage picker chose, and then making a connection between the two, and also making larger connections, for example, to other works of literature, so engaging in intertextuality, and those again could also be other works of film, visual art that we studied this year, and also making personal connections and having other group members make personal connections. You will find this novel is very conducive to making personal connections. And lastly, the summarizer in WordWizard is responsible for making sure that the group is aware of what has been happening in the novel to the point at which you're discussing. So they'll make sure to summarize the events of the novel. And they're also responsible for looking up and researching any words or concepts that are unfamiliar. And they're responsible for giving that information to the group. So these literature circles are going to be exploring the novel titled The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man by James Weldon Johnson. Now, right away you should know that what you're reading is actually not an autobiography. It's a novel. And James Weldon Johnson was very clear in his classification of this as a novel. Confusingly enough, he published this anonymously because he was afraid that if his name were attached to it, then people would think it was actually his autobiography. It was published initially in 1914, and it proved popular. It was republished again in the 1920s, but this time James Weldon Johnson actually attached his name to it, since it had been out long enough. But people still, of course, try to connect his life to the novel. James Weldon Johnson himself is a very fascinating person. He's probably most famous today for co-writing Lift Every Voice and Sing, which has been called by some of the Black national anthem, and is certainly one of the most famous American songs of the 20th century. He was also a novelist. He was a poet. He was a diplomat. He was an ambassador to Venezuela during Theodore Roosevelt's administration. He was a professor. He was a civil rights activist. He was a writer of political tracts and articles and scholarly articles, academia. And he was also eventually his own autobiographer. He wrote his autobiography later as a way to set the record straight, because again, people, even though people were made aware that Autobiography of the Next Colored Man was a novel, he still felt the need to let people know that that was a work of fiction, and here's actually my life. So we're going to be exploring James Weldon Johnson's novel. Now, one of the most controversial aspects of the novel that we're going to be wrestling with as we read it is this concept called passing. It was sort of a sociological phenomena in America at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century for light-skinned African Americans to pass as white. James Weldon Johnson was a relatively light-skinned African American, and so he wrestled with this idea of passing. There were people who did not know he was black, and so it afforded him certain privileges that his darker-skinned relatives and friends and other people in the African American community did not have. So in the novel, this topic of passing for white is sort of a major theme, and it's also something that is very anxiety producing, and there was a lot of controversy even in his own day around this, because James Weldon Johnson at the same time, while sort of wrestling with this idea of passing, and by the way, he never advocated it per se, it's something that he wrestled with, he was also famous for advocating the idea that African Americans should sort of adopt more normative European modes of writing. So, for example, you will see that the Autobiography of the Next Colored Man is written in a so-called standard American English, right? At the time he was writing, novels and poetry were written by African Americans either in dialect or in standard American English. And there was a tension between writers who wrote in dialect who argued that they should write in the language that they heard. And writers like James Weldon Johnson who argued that writing in dialect only gave white audiences the right to be stereotypical, and only gave them it was easy for white readership to pigeonhole African Americans as bumpkins and that sort of thing. Again, dialect authors sort of shot back at Weldon Johnson and said, yes, but there are people in our community who speak this way. So again, with this idea of passing, with sort of this idea of adopting standard American English, quote unquote, a lot's going on in this novel. Along the way, we're also going to talk about, look at other writers who who wrestled with this idea of passing, and also other writers who more openly embrace different sort of modes of blackness, as it were. So why are we reading this novel, and why these lit circles? Here are the essential questions that I want to answer in this unit. What makes a novel a novel? Right? What are the constituent parts of a novel? Why do we read novels? Novels are probably the most popular form of literature. Why do we read them in the first place? And then why do we write them? What is it about the novel that is so popular, and why is it that you really can't be considered, for better or for worse, a true writer, quote unquote, if you don't write a novel? Even though it's silly, a poet, a playwright is certainly a writer, but there's a certain cachet that comes with writing a novel. Why did the writer choose the novel as the means to tell his story? Why couldn't James Weldon Johnson actually write an autobiography? Why not a poem? Why not a play? Why not a piece of visual art? Why not a film? So why a novel? What is the function of a narrator? James Weldon Johnson makes a choice in what narrator type to choose that he uses in the novel, and so the question is, what is their function? And lastly, what is the difference between a story and a plot? And by the way, we'll probably add essential questions to this, but we're really tackling this idea of novel theory, and how the novel's put together and why it's put together that way. And so this actually is a bit of college level discourse. You'll see novel theory classes in college, but it'll definitely make your reading of the novel as a genre much more interesting, and you can go much deeper, hopefully, with this. Now, the other sort of goal of this unit is to get you ready for a novel you're going to read in your junior year, which is Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man in this terribly pixelated picture. If you're interested in applying for Mr. Rosenberg's 11th grade AP English course, you'll be reading Invisible Man over the summer. If you are enrolled in Mr. Rosenberg's standard English class, you'll be reading the novel during the school year. Ralph Ellison most definitely knew James Weldon Johnson's book. In fact, you will note a lot of similarities between the autobiography of an ex-colored man and Invisible Man. So if you're interested in AP next year, I want to give you some sort of ammo, as it were, for your essay that you're going to write over the summer. And having read the autobiography of an ex-colored man will give you some perspective on Ralph Ellison's novel. Ralph Ellison is writing Invisible Man in 1950, after World War II, at the very beginnings of the Civil Rights Movement, whereas James Weldon Johnson is writing his novel, the autobiography of an ex-colored man, really sort of with Reconstruction still in the rearview mirror, much closer to the ending of slavery. So that 30, 40 years between these two books is a lot happened, but obviously some things unfortunately stayed the same. So I'm hoping to give you a bit of a leg up by giving you James Weldon Johnson's novel, and then that'll give you some perspective on Invisible Man. And if you're writing a summer essay for Mr. Rosenberg for his AP class, hopefully you can make some connections between James Weldon Johnson and Ralph Ellison, who, along with Richard Wright, are perhaps the most important novelists to tackle specifically black masculinity as a concept. And we will probably dive a little bit into feminist theory again with James Weldon Johnson, and talk about black masculinity as a social construct, because it's something that you're going to notice in the autobiography of an ex-colored man is what does it mean to be both black and male, and also in Invisible Man, what does Ralph Ellison say about that? And again, to sort of sum up here, these lit circles will hopefully push you to make deeper connections, and to sort of listen and give and take with and from each other, and hopefully you can get below the surface and really dig into this very complex, still controversial, profound piece of literature.